Andrew Jackson. Wow, even just saying the name, it feels loaded, doesn't it?
It really does. A figure of just immense contradiction.
Exactly. You've got this war hero, this champion of the common man, the outsider shaking up Washington. But then there's the other side.
The slave owner, the policies that caused, well, incredible suffering.
Yeah, it's these deep contradictions we really want to dig into today.
And you, our listener, you sent us a fantastic range of sources on Jackson. So our job here is to unpack all that material.
Right. Pull out the key threads, try to understand why he still sparks such fierce debate today. We're looking at the what, but also the why.
The deeper significance.
Absolutely. I mean, from his fairly obscure start through the military victories, those 2 big terms as president, he wore a lot of hats.
He certainly did.
So let's start right at the beginning, early life, because I think even there you start seeing some of these patterns emerge.
Yeah, and right away there's uncertainty. His birthplace. The sources point to the Waxhaw settlement, which kind of sits between North and South Carolina.
Oh, okay. She's not even clear which state.
Jackson himself later claimed South Carolina, but honestly, there's evidence for North Carolina too. Yeah. And then his father died just before he was born. The family moved soon after. It was, well, a pretty unstable start. Loss, uncertainty.
A really tough beginning. But he did get some education. I remember reading his mother hoped he might join the clergy.
That's right, yeah. She sent him to a local clergyman. He learned to read, write, the basics, even a bit of Greek and Latin. But apparently his temperament wasn't quite suited for the ministry. That famous temper probably didn't help.
Probably not, knowing what came later. So from potential preacher to practicing law, that's quite a jump. How did that happen?
Well, he moves to Nashville in 1788. It's still very much a frontier town then, right?
Yeah.
Lots of opportunities if you were ambitious.
Right.
And he plugged himself in pretty quickly, became a protege of William Blount, who was a big deal in the region. By 91, he's Attorney General for the Miro District. A year later, Judge Advocate for the militia. So he was definitely learning how to navigate the system early on.
And alongside that legal career, he was also involved in land speculation and the slave trade. Let's talk about that.
Definitely. He partnered up with John Overton, another lawyer, and their land deals, they were focused on territories claimed by the Cherokee and Chickasaw.
Ah, right there you see the westward expansion mindset, the disregard for indigenous claims.
Exactly. And crucially, he wasn't just speculating on land. He was directly involved in the slave trade itself, moving enslaved people between Nashville and Natchez.
So right from the beginning, that ambition is tied up with, well, exploiting land and people.
It's a recurring theme, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay. So these early ventures, they show this relentless drive, but it's intertwined with exploitation.
Yeah.
And that leads him into actual public office in Tennessee.
Precisely. He's a delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 96. Then when Tennessee becomes a state, he does a short stint as a U.S. representative.
And he was pretty vocal even then.
Oh, yeah. Criticized the Jay Treaty, even criticized George Washington himself. Then he was a U.S. senator, but that lasted, 6 months? He resigned.
Seems impatient.
Well, even then, he was constantly pushing for Tennessee's interests, especially when it came to military action against Native American tribes.
He definitely didn't shy away from conflict. And then he became a judge and head of the Tennessee militia.
Yep. Appointed a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court in 1798. Then, in 1802, elected Major General of a militia. And that election itself was controversial.
Oh. House?
He ran against John Sevier, who was really popular. There was friction, accusations flying back and forth. Almost ended in a duel over insults aimed at Rachel Jackson.
Wow. Personal and political always seemed tangled with him.
Never far apart, it seems.
But his time as a judge, that was also pretty short.
Yeah, he resigned in 1804. Mostly money problems, actually, stemming from those earlier land deals. The economy had taken a downturn in the late 1790s, and he had to sell off a lot of land to cover his debts.
Okay. And it's around then he really digs in at the Hermitage, establishes himself as a planter, which brings us back squarely to slavery.
Exactly. He starts with a smaller plantation, the Hermitage, and builds it up. Becomes a successful planter, a merchant too. Expands it into a big cotton plantation, about 1,000 acres.
And the labor.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Built entirely on the forced labor of enslaved people. In 1804, he owns 9 people. By 1820, it's over 100. By the time he dies, more than 150. Over his whole life, he owned around 300 human beings.
The sources mention this idea of paternalism, that he viewed it as justifiable if people were treated relatively well. But the reality sounds quite different.
It does. I mean, he might have talked about paternalism, but the reality was absolute control. They were property. He used harsh punishments for any perceived defiance, any attempt to escape. There's this really disturbing ad he plays in 1804 for a runaway slave, offers a reward and extra for whipping him. I think it was something like 300 lashes.
300, that's just chilling. It completely undermines any notion of humane treatment.
Starkly illustrates the brutality beneath that veneer.
Yeah. And then 1806, the duel with Charles Dickinson.
Right. Started over a horse racing debt, but like everything with Jackson, it escalated into a matter of honor. Dickinson shot first, hit Jackson in the chest.
But it wasn't fatal.
Amazingly, no, not immediately. Jackson, though wounded, stood his ground, aimed carefully, and returned fire. Killed Dickinson.
Just added to his reputation for being intense and violent.
Solidified it, definitely.
And not long after that, he gets tangled up with Aaron Burr. That's another sort of shadowy, interesting episode.
It is. Burr, the former vice president, tours the West, stops at the Hermitage. He's trying to recruit people for his plan. Well, his plans were pretty ambiguous. Something about Spanish Florida, maybe Texas.
And Jackson was interested.
Initially, yeah. Seemed enthusiastic. He even talked about getting the Tennessee militia ready if needed, maybe for taking Spanish territory. But Jackson also had his doubts. He suspected Burr might be aiming for something more, like secession.
Okay, so he was playing it carefully.
Seems so. Because when President Jefferson issued a warrant for Burr's arrest for treason, Jackson cooperated, helped round up Burr's associates, even testified at the trial. Shows a certain shrewdness beneath that sometimes impulsive exterior.
Right. So this whole early period, ambition, violence, deep involvement with slavery, and then the War of 1812 hits, and that really pushes him onto the national stage.
Huge turning point.
Yeah.
The war is about maritime rights, mainly, but for guys like Jackson, it's also about expansion, about dealing with Native American resistance.
And he jumps right in.
Offers his services, raises volunteers immediately, but their deployment gets delayed. Then they finally get orders to head towards New Orleans, but get stopped in Natchez by General Wilkinson, told to just disband.
Disband. Miles from home.
Exactly. Jackson famously refused, said he wouldn't leave his men stranded, marched them all the way back to Nashville himself under really tough conditions. That's where he got the nickname Old Hickory. Tough, resilient.
Right, Old Hickory. And it was around then he had that brawl with the Benton brothers. Seems like conflict just followed him.
Huh. It really does. Yeah, back in Nashville, a feud over some perceived insults blew up into a physical fight. Jackson got shot in the shoulder, nearly died.
Seriously?
Yeah. He was actually still recovering from that wound when the Creek War broke out after the Fort Mims massacre.
Ah, the Creek War. That was brutal. Started by the Red Sticks, allied with the British, right? Their attack on Fort Mims was devastating.
Horrific, yeah. Governor Blount calls up the militia, and Jackson's objective is crystal clear: crush the Red Sticks.
And his campaign was relentless.
Absolutely. Led his forces south, set up Fort Strother as a base, won some early battles, Talakatchee, Talladega, but then his forces got stretched thin.
Okay.
The Red Sticks actually counterattacked pretty hard at Emukfau and Inotachipo Creek in early 1814.
Yeah.
Jackson had to pull back temporarily.
He came back.
Oh, he came back.
Oh.
Reinforcements. And delivered the final blow at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It was, well, a massacre, frankly. An overwhelming American victory, but huge numbers of Red Stick warriors were killed.
The sources talk about capturing women and children, scorched earth tactics. It's a disturbing picture.
It is. Jackson's approach was total war. Destroy villages, food supplies. Very little distinction made between combatants and non-combatants. William Weatherford, the Red Stick leader, eventually surrendered directly to Jackson.
And after this, Jackson gets promoted.
Yep. Brigadier General, then Major General, gets command of the whole 7th Military District. And then he dictates the Treaty Fort Jackson.
Right. And this treaty wasn't just for the defeated Red Sticks.
No, that's the thing. It forced all Creek people, even those who saw it with the Americans, to give up this enormous chunk of land.
Yeah.
23 million acres.
23 million. That just fundamentally changed the map of the Southeast. Opened it all up for American settlement.
Profoundly. And then Jackson's focus shifts to the British and Spanish down in Florida.
Okay.
Moves his troops to Mobile. Accuses the Spanish governor there of helping hostile Creeks. Then the British land in Pensacola.
And Jackson just goes in, despite it being Spanish territory.
Yeah. Characteristic Jackson. He captures Pensacola. And just weeks later, he gets word the British are planning a major attack on New Orleans. So he races his troops there.
The Battle of New Orleans, the huge victory that made him a national icon, even though the war was technically over by then.
Exactly. Gets to New Orleans, December 1814, immediately declares martial law. He's worried about loyalty in the city, with its diverse population.
And he makes some unusual alliances.
He does. Teams up with Jean Lafitte and his smugglers. Crucially, he also recruits free black men into units and even some Creek warriors, and insists they get paid the same as white soldiers.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he cobbles together this force, maybe 5,000 men, and they're up against this big British army, lots of veterans from the Napoleonic Wars, led by General Pakenham.
And somehow the Americans pull off this incredible win.
Incredible is the word. The British just keep throwing these frontal assaults at the American lines, especially on January 8th. The Americans are dug in, behind defenses. The British casualties are staggering. Pakenham himself is killed. American losses, minimal.
A stunning victory. Really resonated across the country.
Made him a massive national hero overnight.
But even after that amazing victory, his actions in New Orleans, they weren't without controversy, right? He kept martial law in place for a long time.
Way too long, many thought.
Yeah.
The British left, the war was over, but he wouldn't lift martial law. He even approved executions of some militiamen for desertion, arrested a federal judge who challenged him.
Wow.
So, while the victory cemented his hero status, got him thanks from Congress, a gold medal, his actions in New Orleans itself left a bad taste for many there. Tarnished their reputation locally.
It's that pattern again, isn't it? Decisive action, sometimes incredibly effective, but often pushing right up against or maybe over the limits of authority.
A constant tension throughout his career, yeah.
Okay, so after the War of 1812, he's still a major player in the South, which leads us into the First Seminole War.
Right. He stays in command down south. He's also appointed Indian commissioner, so he's negotiating more treaties.
More land cessions.
Oh, yeah. 5 treaties between 1816 and 1820. Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw. All forced to give up more land. And the situation in Florida is still simmering. There's this place called the Negro Fort.
What was that?
A former British fort occupied by escaped slaves, indigenous people. Jackson saw as a threat, ordered its capture in 1816. It was destroyed, many people killed.
So the conflict with the Seminoles just kept escalating.
Exactly. And that leads to the First Seminole War. Secretary of War Calhoun basically gives Jackson free rein to go after the Seminoles.
And Jackson saw this as a chance to grab Florida.
Seems pretty clear. He even wrote to President Monroe saying, basically, just give me the nod and I can take Florida in 60 days. His actions during that war showed, let's say, a distinct lack of respect for Spanish sovereignty. It was all about American expansion.
So this relentless military career, huge victories, but also devastating consequences for Native Americans. And all this national fame naturally leads to talk of the presidency. The 1824 election was weird, wasn't it?
Huh? Weird is a good word. The old Federalist Party was pretty much gone. So you had 4 main candidates, all technically Democratic Republicans. Jackson starts out as sort of a regional favorite.
Not the front runner initially.
No, but he caught fire. He tapped into this growing sense of populism, especially with more white men getting the vote. His image as a war hero, an outsider, it really resonated.
And he even ran for Senate again just before.
Yeah, reluctantly in 1823, mostly to block an opponent and boost his presidential chances.
Okay, so the election happens. Jackson gets the most popular votes, the most electoral votes, but not a majority.
Exactly. No majority in the Electoral College. So the Constitution says the House of Representatives decides, choosing from the top 3.
And Henry Clay, who was 4th, gets eliminated.
Right. Clay couldn't stand Jackson. Throws his support to John Quincy Adams. Adams wins the presidency in the House vote.
And then Adams makes Clay his Secretary of State.
Bingo. Jackson and his supporters immediately cry, corrupt bargain. They claimed Adams and Clay made a deal.
Whether it was true or not, the accusation stuck.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jackson felt cheated. He resigns from the Senate, goes back home, and basically starts campaigning for 1828 right then and there.
And 1828 was a totally different ballgame, really changed American politics.
It really did. Jackson gets nominated super early, like 1825, builds this coalition with key guys like Calhoun, Van Buren. Then you have the Tariff of 1828.
The Tariff of Abominations.
Right. Hugely unpopular in the South, hurt Adams badly there. Jackson just crushed Adams in the election. It really marked the end of that era of good feelings one-party system.
Yeah.
And you clearly had the Democrats and the Whigs emerging.
But the campaign itself, It was nasty, really
Right.
personal.
Oh, incredibly vicious. Both sides slung mud. Jackson was accused of everything: his marriage to Rachel, dueling, murder, executing soldiers, even cannibalism.
Cannibalism, seriously.
Seriously. And the attacks on Rachel were brutal, focusing on her previous marriage and divorce.
And that had a real impact on her.
Devastating. She was deeply distressed by it all. She fell ill and actually died just before Jackson's inauguration.
Oh, wow.
And Jackson, he blamed his political enemies directly, believed their slander killed her. That bitterness carried right into his presidency.
So he comes into office with this huge popular mandate, but also this immense personal grief and anger. What were his main goals, his approach?
Well, his inauguration itself was a big deal. Crowds pouring into Washington, into the White House, signaled a change. Jackson was deeply suspicious of the Adams administration, thought it was corrupt.
So he started investigating.
Yeah. Launched probes into different departments. They did find some stolen Treasury funds, ways to save money in the Navy, and he brought in his idea of rotation in office.
The spoils system, as it became known.
Right. His argument was it prevented corruption, made officials accountable, but in practice, within the first year, about 10% of federal jobs went to loyal Democrats. Critics definitely saw it as rewarding loyalty over competence.
And then there was the petticoat affair. Sounds trivial, but it actually shook things up.
Surprisingly, yes. It was all about Peggy Eaton, the wife of his Secretary of War. There were rumors about her past, and the other cabinet wives, led by Mrs. Calhoun, basically snubbed her socially.
And Jackson took that personally.
Very personally. He defended Peggy fiercely. The whole thing paralyzed his official cabinet. Most of them ended up resigning, except the Postmaster General.
Wow, so social dynamics really impacting government.
Absolutely. It also deepened the split between Jackson and Calhoun. Jackson tried to appoint his ally Van Buren as minister to Great Britain, but Calhoun and his Senate allies blocked it.
Remarkable how personal it all was, and this led to his kitchen cabinet.
Exactly. He got frustrated with the official cabinet, started relying more on this informal group of trusted advisors: Van Buren, Amos Kendall, Francis Preston Blair.
Yeah.
They had huge influence behind the scenes.
Okay, but the really big controversial policy of his presidency has to be the Indian Removal Act.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Jackson was a strong believer in states' rights when it came to controlling land within their borders, including Native American lands. This put him directly at odds with the Supreme Court, particularly the Worcester v. Georgia ruling.
Which he basically ignored.
Famously, yeah.
Yeah.
He signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. It authorized negotiating treaties to exchange native lands in the East for territory west of the Mississippi.
But negotiate wasn't really the reality, was it?
Not in practice. The law said voluntary, but the implementation, it was coercion, bribery, fraud, outright intimidation to get those treaties signed.
And the consequences were just devastating for the tribes involved.
Horrific. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, all forced out. The Choctaw removal was plagued by corruption, suffering. The Seminoles fought back, leading to the Second Seminole War.
And the Cherokee. The Trail of Tears.
The Trail of Tears. Brutally enforced later by Van Buren, but it was the direct result of Jackson's policy. We're talking about maybe 70,000 people forcibly removed. Thousands died from disease, starvation, the harsh conditions.
Such a profoundly dark chapter. And a central part of his legacy that's viewed so differently now. At the same time, he's dealing with a nullification crisis.
Right. This flares up over that tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina, feeling the economic pain, argues for nullification.
The idea that a state can just void a federal law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
John C. Calhoun, Jackson's own vice president, secretly authors the argument for it. Jackson is absolutely furious. He's a unionist, believes federal law is supreme.
So this puts him head-to-head with his own VP?
Oh, yeah. Huge personal and political break. It gets really tense. South Carolina actually passes an ordinance of nullification in 1832, saying the tariffs are void there.
How close did it get to actual conflict?
Perilously close. Jackson called nullification treason. Asked Congress for the force bill permission to use the military to enforce the tariff in South Carolina.
Wow.
Thankfully, Henry Clay and Calhoun broker a compromise tariff in 1833, which lowers rates over time. South Carolina backs down on nullifying the tariff, but then, just to make a point, they nullify the force bill.
Huh. Symbolic defiance.
Totally. But Jackson, privately, he thought the whole tariff thing was just an excuse. He believed the real issue underlying it all was slavery and the threat of disunion.
Okay. And then there's the other huge fight of his presidency, the bank war. He really hated the Bank of the United States.
Deeply. Questioned if it was even constitutional. Saw it as corrupt, giving special favors to the rich and connected. Too much foreign influence, potentially?
His supporters echoed those criticisms.
Loudly.
Oh.
Accusations of bribery, undemocratic power. Jackson himself, while maybe saying publicly he was open to a reformed bank, privately seemed determined to kill it.
And Henry Clay tried to use it against him in the 1832 election.
Yeah, Clay pushed for the bank's recharter early, thinking it would be a winning issue. Jackson responds with that powerful veto message in July 32, railed against the power of the wealthy elite.
And that message worked. It helped him win re-election decisively.
Absolutely. Clay miscalculated. Jackson might have lost some pro-bank votes, but his anti-bank stance fired up his base, especially out west and south. Plus, his stance on Indian removal was popular in those regions.
Right. So even with the nullification mess in South Carolina, he wins big.
Landslide. Clear mandate, though South Carolina itself didn't vote for him or Clay that year.
But the bank war wasn't over with the veto, right? He then moved to remove the federal deposits. That caused another huge uproar.
Huge. After re-election, he goes on the offensive, orders federal money pulled out of the Bank of the United States and put into various state banks.
The pet banks.
Exactly. His opponents called them pet banks. This move really solidified the opposition, led to the formal creation of the Whig Party. They saw him acting like a king, King Andrew I.
And the Senate actually censured him for it.
They did, in 1834, for exceeding his authority over the Treasury. But the House supported him, voted against rechartering the bank. By 1836, the federal money was out of the BUS.
But these pet banks, did they handle the federal money well?
Well, that's the problem. They started lending much more freely, often for land speculation out west, especially in those lands newly available after Indian removal.
So it fueled a bubble.
Pretty much. Jackson tried to cool things down with the specie circular demanding gold or silver for Western land purchases. But that, combined with another act moving federal surpluses around, destabilized the Eastern banks.
Which led to
The Panic of 1837, a major economic depression that hit right after he left office, but his policies definitely contributed to it. Unintended consequences, perhaps, of trying to decentralize financial power.
It seems like his actions often had these complex, sometimes contradictory results. Amidst all this political fighting, he was actually physically assaulted, and someone tried to assassinate him.
Yeah, pretty wild. In 1833, a dismissed naval officer named Randolph struck him. Jackson actually didn't press charges.
Huh.
Then in 1835, right outside the Capitol, a guy named Richard Lawrence steps out, points 2 pistols at Jackson, point-blank range. Both pistols misfired. Just incredible luck or bad priming. Jackson, furious, apparently went after Lawrence with his cane.
Wow. What happened to Lawrence?
Found not guilty by reason of insanity. But yeah, the first actual assassination attempt on a sitting U.S. president.
Just underscores the intensity of the times and the feelings about Jackson himself. Throughout all this, his position on slavery, it remained unchanged. Right?
Firmly. He remained a major slave owner, defended the institution using those paternalistic arguments while overseeing the reality of forced labor.
Okay, briefly, what about foreign policy during his terms? Any major achievements?
Yes, some successes. Negotiated trade deals, including one with Siam, first with an Asian nation. Settled some long-standing financial claims with European countries.
The French claims were tricky, though.
Very tricky. Took some strong diplomatic pressure, Jackson threatening reprisals before France finally paid up. He was also really keen on getting Texas.
From Mexico.
Yeah. Tried to buy it multiple times. As more Americans moved there and the Texas Revolution happened, he watched closely. He hesitated on immediate annexation, worried about stability and the slavery debate it would ignite.
But he did recognize Texas.
On his very last day in office, yeah. He formally recognized the Republic of Texas.
And he appointed quite a few Supreme Court justices, too.
6 in total. Most significantly, Roger B. Taney as Chief Justice after John Marshall died. Taney, of course, would later write the Dred Scott decision. Jackson also signed a law adding 2 seats to the court. Definitely left his mark on the judiciary.
So after these 2 incredibly packed terms, he retires. But he didn't exactly fade away, did he?
Not at all. Remained influential. Backed Van Buren hard in 1840, though Van Buren lost, partly due to that ongoing depression. Jackson cheered when President Tyler vetoed Whig bank bills later.
And he kept pushing for Texas.
Oh, yeah, fervently. He was convinced the British were maneuvering to gain influence there, and he believed Texas was rightfully part of the Louisiana Purchase anyway.
He played a role in getting Polk elected in '44.
A key role. Polk was strongly pro-annexation. Jackson helped make him the Democratic nominee. And just before Jackson died, the Senate finally passed the bill to annex Texas. He lived to see that happen.
He died in 1845, age 78. Sounds like he was politically engaged right to the end.
He really was. Died at the Hermitage. His reported last words expressed hope of meeting everyone, white and black, in heaven, buried next to Rachel.
Let's touch on his personal life a bit more. No biological children, but they adopted Andrew Jackson Jr. and took in other children, including indigenous children.
Yes, their household was quite large. Adopted their nephew, Andrew Jr., raised Rachel's other nephews, also took in orphan children of friends, and importantly, yes, they were guardians to 3 Native American children, Lincoya, Theodore, and Charlie. It adds another layer to the complexity.
And that famous temper, we hear about it constantly. Was it just rage, or was there strategy too?
Probably both. His reputation for being quick-tempered and willing to fight certainly intimidated people, but some sources suggest he could also turn it on and off, use it strategically. He definitely took things personally, held grudges. Loyalty was everything to him. Famously said on his deathbed, his only regrets were not shooting Henry Clay and not hanging John C. Calhoun.
Wow. Still intense.
Intensely loyal, intensely unforgiving. But opponents sometimes mistook that directness for a lack of political smarts, and they often underestimated him.
And his religion? He joined the church formally, but only after retiring.
That's right. Joined the Presbyterian Church in Nashville in 1838. Said he waited so no one could accuse him of doing it for political reasons.
Okay. So we've covered this huge sweep of his life. Now, Blitis heresy. He's still incredibly controversial, polarizing.
Absolutely. Views on him were divided even back then, and they still are. Historical interpretations have shifted dramatically. The 1920s saw him as the common man hero. Schlesinger's Age of Jackson in the 40s linked him to the New Deal.
Right. And presidents since have invoked him. But more recently, there's been a real pushback, the $20 bill debate.
Exactly. The move to replace his portrait with Harriet Tubman's, it got delayed, but the Biden administration is pursuing it again. That debate itself shows how contested his legacy is right now.
And the Indian Removal Act, it's viewed now as ethnic cleansing, isn't it?
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
The use of coercion, military force. The forced displacement is widely seen as ethnic cleansing. Some historians even discuss it in terms of genocide, given the devastating impact on Native societies.
Mm-hmm. The Second Seminole War being a prime example of the violence involved.
A direct result. Fierce resistance met with ruthless force.
And it's disturbing to see his image sometimes co-opted by white supremacist groups today. The protests targeting his statues in 2020 really highlighted this ongoing reckoning.
Yeah. And you see his ranking among presidents in historical polls declining since the 60s, as awareness of his Native American policies has grown. But he still ranks high on lists of polarizing presidents. That captures it well.
Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist champion, perpetrator of terrible injustice. It seems impossible to hold all those things together easily.
It is. And this deep dive, using all the material you sent in, hopefully gives a framework for understanding those complexities. We've seen the different facets, the ambition, the achievements, the devastating consequences.
Ultimately, his story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? That celebrated figures can also be responsible for profound wrongs.
Precisely.
So as we wrap up, maybe the question to leave you, our listener, with is this. How do we reconcile these contradictions? How does wrestling with a figure like Jackson shape our understanding of American identity, American progress, American justice, even today?
It's a crucial question. We hope this discussion gives you plenty to think about based on the sources and the enduring impact of this era.